Hey, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. And this is going to be a very special session. As you all know, we have very special guests with us today, Charlaine Harris and Catriona Miller. And for those of you who don't know, Charlaine Harris, although I doubt, but Charlaine Harris is a true daughter of the South. She was born in Mississippi and has lived in Tennessee, South Carolina, Arkansas, and Texas. After years of dabbling with poetry, plays, and essays, her career as a novelist began when her husband invited her to write full-time. Her first book, Sweet and Deadly, appeared in 1981. When Charlaine's career as a mystery writer began to falter, she decided to write a cross-genre book that would appeal to fans of mystery, science fiction, romance, and suspense. She could not have anticipated the huge surge of reader interest in the adventures of a barmaid in Louisiana, or the fact that Alan Ball would come knocking at her door. Since then, Charlaine's novels have been adapted for several other television series, with 2 in development now. Charlaine is a voracious reader. She has 1 husband, 3 children, 2 grandchildren, and 2 rescue dogs. She leads a busy life. www.charlaineharris.com is her website, and I will be sharing this shortly on the chat box. Dr. Catriona Miller, joining us from Glasgow today, is a senior lecturer in media at Glasgow Caledonian University with a particular interest in feminism and mythology from a Jungian perspective. Publications include the monograph Cult TV Heroines for Bloomsbury 2020 and co-editor of Exploring Depth Psychology and the Female Self, Feminist Views from Somewhere by Routledge 2021. Her PhD thesis was entitled Bloodspirits, Jungian Approach to the Vampire Myth. So, Catriona, you know a thing or two about vampires, and we're here today to hear all about this. How does pop culture approach vampires? One of the world's most famous vampire novelists with us this evening or morning, depending on what side of the planet you're on, Charlaine Harris, who is also the writer behind the popular TV series True Blood and others, will be in conversation with Dr. Catriona Miller about the versatility of vampires in today's popular fiction and television series. From discussing Charlaine's Sookie, Stackhouse, Gunnie Rose, and Harper Connelly series, the discussion will focus on the following. Why are people drawn to the vampire genre? What psychological effects do vampire novels and movies have on people? What does this say about the readers, maybe the writers and the viewers as well? So, Charlaine and Catriona, a very big and warm welcome to you both. And I would like to start the conversation by asking Charlaine to tell us a little bit about her novels. So for the fly on the wall, if there is any, if anyone doesn't know or would like to know more.
This is my 40th year as a published writer. I never thought I would last this long. I wasn't sure at first if I would ever get published. So it's kind of a thrill for me to be here doing what I love to do, talking to other readers. I write a wide variety of things. I never wanted to write the same book over and over. I like to stretch and flex and keep myself fresh. If I wrote about the same characters for, more than, 13 or 14 books, I just would lose interest. And that means the readers, in my opinion, would also sense my lack of enthusiasm. So I like to change around. I like to change genres. I like to invent new people, and I love to live in new worlds. The worst thing to me is being bored. My whole career has been an attempt to keep myself from being bored.
It's amazing the things we do to keep ourselves from being bored. I think that's one of the biggest inspirations for creators. So what inspires you, Charlaine? What is your biggest inspiration or many of your inspirations?
Well, if I don't work, I don't get paid. That's an inspiration. I just like to be inside my own head and to create things that exist there and to express them to readers. There's a relationship between the writer and the reader. I don't do what readers ask me to do because it has to be my own creation or it won't be authentically from me. And I feel like I have enough readers that I can tell people do like what I create. So that kind of reinforces my determination to have it all come from my own head. It's just it's a daily process of getting outside the ordinary and going into the extraordinary and flexing muscles I didn't know I had. They just happened to be in my head.
Wow. Wow, I like that. So it's like stepping into a whole new inner world that you didn't know existed the way it did.
Yes.
Wow. And that makes your characters alive, I guess, right? So to you, they are there. They exist.
Yes. Well, I know it's all in my head. Uh, I never, I'm a little skeptical from my own point of view when writers tell me their characters did things all on their own. And I thought,
Nah.
that seems a little schizophrenic. Uh, but characters do develop as you write them. And sometimes you understand that you've developed a character in such a way that what they might have done earlier has changed. And that's always a pleasant surprise.
Mm. Wow. So why are vampires a big thing for you? What is it
Well, they
about
weren't. They weren't for a while. Um, I really was writing about Sookie. The
Yeah.
vampires were incidental to her story. I wanted to write about a woman who was dating a creature who was not human anymore. And it after a long time of thinking about it and trying to decide what her disability was that forced her to do this, I decided vampires because they're not alive anymore and they have a whole different set of uh, values and goals that people who are still warm and breathing don't have. But Sookie never wanted to be a vampire. She loves the sun. She wants to have a baby. She is really traditional in a lot of ways, and yet I hope very much her own person.
And did you like Snoop Dogg's song on Sookie?
I did. He's such a funny guy. Uh, I really enjoy his life has turned out to be pretty unexpected too, it seems to me.
I just shared it here just in case anyone would like to see it later on. So that's the video from YouTube. And how about the movies versus the books? So did you like the movie series, the Aurora Tea Garden series, True Blood? When you compare them with the novels, how does
I
it
don't com-
feel?
I don't compare them with the
No.
novels. They're
Uh-huh.
completely separate experiences. What I really
Okay.
loved about them was the fact that people went and bought my books after they watched them. The
Uh-huh.
books are my concern, not the movie, not the television shows. Even
Hmm.
Midnight Texas, which I thought was really good. I really regretted it getting canceled after 2 seasons because, I never got asked to write any more of the books, which I would have enjoyed doing. That there's just really no comparison. I mean, I watched them all out of respect, and so I can intelligently comment on them, or at least comment on them. But they're not my creative generation, and they're not my ballywick. I just try to enjoy what other creative people have produced using my characters.
Hmm. So when you see the characters on the screen, like for example, Candace Cameron as Aurora Rowe, um, do you find that it matches or it reflects what you had in mind? How she
No,
looks like, how she acts? No. Oh,
no,
okay.
no, not
Huh.
really. How could it? Because the character has been alive in my head for many years. And and then someone pops up and says, "Oh, now I'm Sookie or now I'm Aurora." And I go, "Well, you're the TV version. You're the TV version. The other version is still alive and in my head."
Mm.
I think there was one really big difference with the True Blood TV show, which was that it went from being very much Sookie's story, because you told them all very much from Sookie's point of view, to being
Yes.
quite an ensemble piece with a lot of different characters, some of whom were in the novels or in a different way or briefly there and so on. And I think that made quite a big change from page to screen in that case.
I agree, Katrina. And it seemed to me that that was the biggest difference. On the other hand, it's easy to write a series from one point of view. The whole series was written from Sookie's point of view, but you really can't do a television show that way because Anna would have had to have been in every scene in the TV show, and that's just not sustainable. They had to have the backstories of the other characters more developed so they would get some screen time too. That's what Alan
Hmm.
told me anyway.
So, Catriona, would you tell us a little bit about your research into vampire fiction?
Well, it really began because I've always been a fan of vampire films in particular. And when I was doing some academic work on vampires at the time, it seemed like all the discussion and explanation of what vampires were all about was coming very much from a sort of Freudian psychoanalytic perspective. And that didn't ring true for me. It didn't seem to answer what it was that I liked about them. And so somehow I ended up doing a PhD at Stirling University, where I spent quite some time watching. It seemed like I did make the mistake of adding up at one point all the hours of films that I'd watched in pursuit of the PhD, and frankly it was far too many, and no one should really have to watch Zoltan, Hound of Dracula. I've done it, so you don't have to. So yeah. So I was trying to figure out why they were so popular, and not just popular sort of then or now, but seemingly throughout history. And so coming at it from a Jungian point of view and trying to figure out whether or not vampires could be considered an archetype was really where I was sort of going with it. So I ended up kind of exploring myths and legends of vampires from not quite the dawn of history, although it felt like that at times, all the way through to the to the end of the 20th century, and seeing what was common and what was different about them. So there was a really big distinction between the vampires of certainly Eastern European folklore, which were barely human, it seemed, in many ways, and not the sort of suave, aristocratic, kind of charming figure that they become. So that was one of the first things that was really interesting. And so having a great interest in history, I was kind of really interested in trying to unpick what happens and how. So it seemed to me that the Eastern European vampires were very much associated with the Jungian idea of the shadow archetype. But then from the start of the 19th century, that no longer seemed to be the right answer, because there is this shift which seemed to be the coming together of quite a number of different sort of threads. So there'd been ballads across Europe about the unquiet dead and ghosts coming back to haunt people, and there were stories of vampires being dug up, like historical rather than folklore. So imperial doctors were being sent off to villages where things were happening, and the villagers would say, oh, it's a vampire that's doing this, and they would go and dig up the grave of the person that they said, and there was sort of, the bodies hadn't decayed as they expected them to, so the doctors were making quite detailed medical notes about this, so that kind of added to the mythology. But then it all kind of seems to come together with the figure of the Romantic poet Lord Byron, who was mad, bad, and dangerous to know, and charming, and so on. And his daughter wrote The Vampire, which was the first novel in English, where suddenly the vampire is this charming, devilish character. And that's the one that then kind of starts moving through 20th century film and television. But there's definitely another shift that sort of happens towards the end of the 1970s, where suddenly the vampire becomes much more sympathetic. So although the Lord Byron-esque vampires are very charming, they are dangerous, they are bad. They are going to kill you, and then sort of through the 70s this softens up much more, perhaps from the 1979 film by John Badham, which is a Dracula adaptation, where Dracula is certainly the hero of the film for the first time, and then this sort of permeates through lots of other areas of novels and films as well. So it definitely, if I can sort of say, towards the Twilight novels and the Sookie Stackhouse novels, the vampires are more sympathetic to the heroines and not necessarily absolutely going to kill them, although maybe still not very good for them. Sorry, that was my PhD in 10 minutes. So well done for listening, everybody.
So this odd combination of being charming and not so good for you, putting it nicely, might kill you, might not, but either way, not so good for you. Do you find vampires to be a reflection of the psychopath? Are they like the icon of a psychopath, or the reflection, or the manifestation? I don't know, incarnation, something.
Well, since in the time since I finished my PhD, which was a number of years ago now, I have thought about this further, because watching a lot of the other shows and films and novels and things that have come along since then, I started thinking about it less, I guess, from the figure of the vampire and more towards the women in the stories. And I ended up, I think my position now is that, to me, if we're talking in very sort of broad cultural terms about these kind of figures, I think there is an element of what the Jungians would call the animus. So it's like the inner masculine of women, but very much still touching on the shadow archetype. So that's where the kind of bad bit comes from. But I do think it's got a lot to do with patriarchal culture, and that for most women in their lives, you don't always know who the good men are. You don't always know, is this the guy who's gonna be my husband and the love of my life, or the guy who's gonna kill me? Because most domestic violence is men that and unfortunately most sexual violence comes from, not from strangers actually, but from men that So I think it is more of a manifestation of perhaps women's ambivalence about, or heterosexual women anyway, I don't know, but their ambivalence about men, and that charming attractiveness, but also that element of, is this also dangerous? That's where I've ended up anyway.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Charlaine, do you see them the same way, or do you have vampires in your novels to represent anything specific, like patriarchy, psychopaths, I don't know, toxic masculinity? Do they have any special significance, or is it just vampires?
I'm sure sometimes a vampire is just a vampire, but in my books, they represent any oppressed minority in a lot of ways. Sometimes people ask me if I intended that, which I find peculiarly offensive. Yes, of course I did. I mean, I know what I'm writing. And if that seems defensive, it's because people have actually asked me that several times. Yes, they're an oppressed minority in my books, but that doesn't mean they're totally sweetness and light. Oppressed minorities can have bad members just like any other group of people, and vampires are definitely numbered among them. I was specifically thinking about the gay community when I wrote the books, because in my books, their vampires are misunderstood. They have their secrets. They're not totally sure that they want to be exposed for being vampires, but they're making an attempt to come out of the coffin, as it were, and become productive members of society, and hoping that that works out for them. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But that was what I was aiming for.
I think the vampire does absolutely have that element of the outsider about them. They are always on the fringes of society and civilization, and they can't be completely separate from it because obviously they need humans. So but they're definitely kind of in the dark, and that was one of the fun things about the Sookie Stackhouse novels, was kind of going, well, actually we are here and we have been on the fringes, but now we're coming out and you're going to see us and we're going to be part of everything.
Yeah, it's kind of a trade-off. They want to be part of the mainstream of life. At the same time, we're their cattle. So there's always going to be that back story, that dark part, that they're saying, hey, but no, now we're harmless. We can drink manufactured blood, so we're not going to eat you anymore, which is not true. But they've got a good reason to come out, because they can drink artificial blood. But the fact is, it's like eating a vegan steak when you want a real one.
That's exactly what I was thinking of. I was like, beyond burger material, Wow, so this is really very interesting. Do you think that, this is part of why people are drawn to vampire novels, stories, movies? Is it because of this element of being misunderstood, or being on the margin, or on the fringes, or, trying to come out and finding it difficult?
All of the above, I would say. And then people are always drawn to the romantic outsider, whether he's Shane or any other romantic, any of the Clint Eastwood loners who ride off into the dusk at the end. I mean, vampires have to come out of the dusk and go back to it. But it's the same thing. The outsider is very often romanticized, when in fact there may not really be anything romantic there, but it's how we see the person who is following their own their own dictates rather than ours.
Mhm.
I think it's definitely part of the success of the vampire as a kind of cultural figure is that flexibility, that in a way the vampire can be whatever you need it to be, you know, and that's why it as a kind of monster who is very close to us, of course, us humans, it can manifest in all kinds of different ways. I mean, there have been, you know, psychic vampire stories, alien vampire stories, you name it.
It's in that.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is about vampires. How about, you know, the people that choose to read or watch vampire themed movies and novels? So we just said that they are drawn to this element of being out or being on the margin. But what does that tell us about people? Does it tell us something about society? Does it tell us that people feel more misunderstood, or does it tell us that people are drawn to the unknown? What does it really say about the readers? I mean, seeing such a huge popularity of vampire novels, what would that tell you about your readers, Charlaine and Catriona? I mean, what do you think from a psychological perspective?
I think a lot of readers see the romantic side of vampires as the eternal guy who can come sweep you off your feet, and because vampires are all rich, not they can give you everything you want, and they're totally fixated on human women for some reason that really escapes me. Uh, and they get the romance of it, but not the reality, which is that if you were the last human on earth, this guy would have to kill you because you have his food.
Uh-huh.
So they kind of romanticize the undertone of extreme danger, I think,
Okay.
and ignore that, which is something I try to reintroduce when I'm writing about vampires, because by golly, it's crazy to date a guy like that, or a woman, truly.
I think it's a very big question that you're asking, Rula Marie.
Maybe people use it, I mean, as Charlene is saying, like they're looking for this, you know, to fulfill these romantic fantasies of, you know, flirting with danger and so on. But what about like the I don't know, I mean, what does
Well,
it tell us about what people want psychologically,
well,
Catriona?
yeah,
Does that show up in any of your studies?
I think it's well, in my Cult TV Heroines book, I was kind of
Yeah.
trying to understand what it was about cult TV shows that
Yeah.
people got so passionate about. I mean, like really extra passionate about, and you know, to the point where they would learn Klingon for Star Trek, or you know, a kind of pretend language, but people do speak Klingon now. But to sort of try and understand what was happening for people when they wanted to be within the story world so strongly, and would often be very creative themselves in response. I'm sure there's a raft of fan fiction. In fact, I know there is a raft of fan fiction around Sookie and the True Blood series. So people are actually writing their own stories of that because they want to be part of that world so much. So I was exploring another Jungian idea of the transcendent function as a sort of path towards better psychic balance, I suppose, or individuation, and the idea that people would find the symbols that were meaningful for them. So Jung was very keen on symbols as able to bridge the conscious and the unconscious in the psyche. together and sort of find a kind of way of interacting with them. So my hunch is that really figures like the vampire are able to activate that transcendent function for people. And if you were to sort of look into each individual person, they would have different reasons, I'm sure, or different aspects of the figures that they want to, you know, that was the hook for them, if you like. So the whole sort of you know, Team Eric, Team Bill kind of debate amongst the fans, you know, that you know, exploring why some would go one direction, some would go in another direction. Or Team Pam, even, you know, would I love that.
Me too.
You know, would probably sort of elicit quite individual answers to that question, but the power of those figures to act in this sort of transcendent, in terms of the transcendent function, yeah, that was very interesting.
Wow. So, the thing with vampires, Charlene, what makes you a fan of vampires? That's what we want to know. Is it the romantic aspect as well? Or is it
Well,
danger?
Can I ask us a more specific question, Charlene? Just,
yes.
Was there a particular story, vampire story, that either in a film or a short story or a novel that is the first one that you remember reading or seeing?
Well, the classic Dracula, of course, because that was so good. And let me say right here, the Gary Oldman interpretation was bizarrely interesting, but bizarre. I think I was always interested in the vampire in literature, and I did watch a lot of vampire movies. When the original Nosferatu, where he has the long, 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 scary fingers and he's so horrible. Now, to me, that is probably a more true representation of what a vampire would really be like. And I thought, you know, this is fascinating and it's really scary, but it's not what I want to write. I wanted a softened version where the vampires had personalities that weren't always great, but they had personalities. They related to humans. They looked like humans except for being, you know, so pale.
Yeah.
So a slightly more humanized version, but still dangerous, was kind of what I settled on to make the book dynamic work like I wanted it to. Does that answer your question, or did I stray? I usually stray.
No, that's really interesting. You know, there's a story that the designer of the 1922 Nosferatu film, Albin Grau, so not the director, but the designer, he said, you know, at the time that his idea of what the vampire would look like in that came from having met a peasant in Serbia a few years before the film was made. So it was made in 1922, I think, who told him all this story about his grandfather who had been a vampire and had to be dug up, and he produced all this paperwork and everything. And that's where he said that he got that idea from. Or that, so it was interesting to sort of look at how that actually, that film tried to go back, sort of jump over Bram Stoker, although it was based on his novel, back to the Eastern European tradition of the vampire as it had been in folklore. So so that film does kind of pull out folklore again and ignore Bram Stoker's version of Dracula.
They're all interesting. I think you have to pick what really speaks to you and use what you need to make your book turn out the way you want it to. You have to reinvent it inside yourself, I suppose. And I want to point out, I've had plenty of people, well, not plenty, but several people in my signing lines who tell me that they are vampires.
I
or
was going to ask you
werewolves.
about
Yeah, I'm going, show me. And that hasn't happened yet. So I'm still waiting for the day, because I would be excited up until the moment they ate me, but I would be pretty thrilled about seeing that happen.
Absolutely. Well,
Wow.
it's fascinating you say that, because and you mentioned the Francis Ford Coppola version of Dracula, the film with Gary Oldman, and I always loved that he called it Bram Stoker's Dracula, and yet kind of
Yeah,
totally
it's so not.
I know this whole kind of past life storyline that's not in the novel at all. I sort of salute him for that.
I think Gary Oldman is a very brave actor, and I really thought it was visually a very interesting treatment, but not the one that would ultimately stick in my heart as a the depiction that meant the most to me.
So, do you think that this pop culture vampire space for in pop culture, do you think it affects people? So, for example, Charlene said that, people might come up and say, well, I'm a vampire. Do you think people are being encouraged into this, literal vampiricism because of the movies and the books and the novels, or do you think it's always been there? Catriona, you probably know a little bit about it. Charlene, you know about your readers. So what do you think? What effect does it have on them? Most of them read it just for fun. I mean, and to sort of delve into the world of vampires, but does it affect people? Like, do you think people believe that they're vampires because of the books?
That's a tough one, because you end up in the whole media effects debate, which is very contested territory, to say the least. I don't on the whole think that the media or films can make you do things, but I think that, going back to what I was saying about the transcendent function, I think it can perhaps people find a hook for what they're feeling anyway, and then they can become identified with that, which I think over identification is probably tending into towards the kind of territory where you might want a little bit of counselling to kind of help deal with those issues that are taking you in that direction. But I mean, I know, absolutely know that there are plenty of people who would describe themselves as vampires, but I wouldn't say that it was the novels that it necessarily there. But I don't know, Charlaine, if you've had any particular experiences with some of your more ardent fandom.
I've had some experiences. I can tell you that. But I think mostly people see it as a romantic alternate lifestyle, when truly it really isn't healthy at all, at least from my point of view. And it can certainly lead to some very dicey situations if people believe too ardently that they have vampiric abilities. There's lots of modern medical issues with drinking each other's blood that I'm sure you're all aware of. To me, if there was a real vampire, I don't know if you watch What We Do in the Shadows, but the joy-sucking vampire, there is, I think that is a pretty realistic depiction. People who just suck the life out of every situation and bore everyone to tears. He's just perfect. He's just perfect. I thought, now that kind of vampire I can believe in.
It's important symbolically. I mean, you can suck the life out of every situation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there are
So
people who are really good at doing that.
uh-huh. What about the Gunnie Rose series?
So far,
Any
no vampires, but a lot of magic, a zombie or two, and I'm just having a great time writing it. To me, this is one of the best things I've ever written, and I'm so proud of the books. The fourth one will be out next year, though the date has changed, probably August. It's called The Serpent in Heaven. And it's really more about the protagonist, who is Elizabeth Rose. It's more about Elizabeth's younger sister, younger half sister, who is older than we ever believed and has many tricks up her sleeve. And it was just so much fun to write about her. I've never written a book about a protagonist that young. And since I'm going to be 70 this year, it was a big stretch. It was a big stretch. So I hope I achieved what I was looking to do.
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean,
Can I ask
how much history does? Go ahead, Catriona. Sorry.
Yeah, it was really I was interested because I just finished the third one of the Gunnie Rose ones recently, and they're such a hoot, and she's such a great sort of character as well. You seem to be drawn towards alternate histories for the States, for America, with vampires and then the Holy Russian Empire and the sort of different trajectory in the Gunnie Rose books. And I just wondered how much fun you have sort of rewriting the history of America.
So much fun, so much fun. And the days when my assistant and I did the map of Bon Temps, that was just great. And then the day I did the map of the United States as it had fragmented during the Depression, most fun ever. You know, those Canadians, they came down and took the northern part of the US. You've got to watch them. So that was just so much fun. I just it's being creative in a different way when you start dividing up the map and having the Russian royal family established in California. I just thought, oh, it made so much sense once I thought about it. I understand that not everyone can see the sense it makes, but as long as I'm satisfied that it makes sense to me, then I have a great time.
Yeah,
it must be a lot of fun playing around with history, shuffling things around.
It is. And when it all comes together, it's just, as any writer will tell you, when a lot of elements come together and suddenly you see the world expanding in a wonderful way, it's just, it's a great writing day.
I think you found a real kind of like little pressure point in American history as well, to kind of sort of moving into the Depression and that kind of part, and showing a kind of different way that it could have gone.
Things could have fallen out that way. I really believe if the assassination attempt had been successful, the orderly succession that we have now, if the president falls, it's the vice president. If the vice president falls, it's the Speaker of the House. That wasn't in place then. It was just like a free-for-all. So it seemed pretty, it seemed more plausible to me to set it in the 30s when everything was converging and there was a real possibility that there wouldn't be a United States.
It's such a fascinating series, actually.
Is Elizabeth Rose based on any particular Texan women that you've encountered?
Elizabeth is, I wanted to write, frankly, I wanted to write about a woman who killed a lot of people and got away with it. So that was one reason for moving it back in time also. And Elizabeth is just, she's great at what she does, and what she does is shoot. She's a shooter. So I had to find a way for her to make her living doing that. So everything kind of expanded out of that little kernel of an idea. And that's how Lisbeth came to be. And she's just so brave, so courageous, and so dedicated.
And she's not worried about being nice all the time either.
No, she isn't. I love that. You know, I grew up Southern, and boy, that was the big thing. No matter how angry you were, you did not show it. So to me, it's a joy to write about someone who is absolutely who she is. No pretense or soft shell or any other kind of concealment. She is who she is, and she's happy with that.
And so are the readers.
You know, I hope so. I would love to keep writing books about her, but you know, readers determine that with their checkbook or their debit card or whatever they use. I can't write books if the publisher is not selling them.
So what is the most special series or standalone, anything that you've written? Which one is the dearest to you?
Oh, well, the Sookie one made me very prosperous. So, and I did enjoy writing them pretty much up until I got close to the end. And then I thought, you know, I'm enjoying these and I've got enough story to get me through the next 3 books. But after that, I want to be done. I want to move on and do something else. It's like being possibly, you know, in a long running TV series. And finally you just think, no, I have to go play a psychopathic killer. You know, I just can't do this anymore.
How about your characters? Who's your favorite character?
Oh, that's pretty impossible to say. I kind of love the one I'm with.
Okay. So it's always the one that you are writing about.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
I think it's an interesting point you make though, Charlaine, about, you know, once it's run its course, once you've got to the end of the story, is that from a creative point of view, you can't manufacture that, you know, after a point.
That, you know, I know writers who write the same book over and over, and they're making their living, and I respect that. And they seem content and happy with it, and their readers are too. That's okay. I'm just not like that. I just can't do it. When I'm through, I'm through. And to me, it's like cheating the reader if I don't love what I'm doing. Maybe that's pretentious, but that's the way I feel.
I don't know. There's definitely, for a writer, there's that engagement with your own like inner world of creativity, and you have to be true to that. Otherwise, I think the readers can tell that. I'm not a writer. Well, I'm an academic writer.
Well, you are, so.
Yeah. But.
So the writing process itself, Charlaine, how long on average does it take you to finish one book?
As long as my contract says I have.
And
that
you
is
always
how long
meet
it takes me. Huh?
You always meet the deadline. You never need an extension.
No, I did not. During COVID, I did not meet my deadline. My brain went to sleep, and it took it months to wake up. My husband and I had COVID, and then we got our vaccinations. So I'm as safe as I can possibly be. I'm going to have a booster too. I really never want to go through that again. It was unpleasant, though we didn't have to be hospitalized. So we were very, very lucky. We got it from our grandson, a little bitty fella. So
Mhm.
we all lived, and we were all okay. So a lot to be grateful for, but my brain just went to sleep. I know writers who said, "Oh, I've got all this extra time in isolation. I'll just write 2 more books." I'm going, "How can you do that?" I just felt like if I sat in my chair and watched TV all day, that was doing pretty good. I just I'm just now getting back into my work ethic. It took me forever to finish the book I was supposed to finish, but I did.
Well, speaking of COVID, do you think that would make that might have some room in one of your novels, future novels?
Well, the Spanish flu was around at the same time, the Depression and the Dust Bowl and
Yeah.
the banking failure
Mhm.
in the 30s, and it is in the next book.
Okay.
Can I ask a question from the chat from Grace Topping? Because she's asking, what is something you wished you'd written?
Okay, two things. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, the late, great Shirley Jackson. I mean, if you want a primer in how to write short stories or novels, Shirley Jackson. I also wish I'd written Jurassic Park because I love me some dinosaurs. And it's just all, "Rawr, I just love it. I really wish I'd written that.
Well, what
Brilliant.
makes you write in general? I mean, what would you like to tell us before we about what made you write before we take on the other questions of the audience? There are so many questions flowing in.
Well, what made me write? That was all I ever wanted to do. I've been
Huh.
so extremely fortunate in that I had the desire and I had the opportunity and I had the talent to do what I really, really wanted to do. It's just a never-ending source of gratitude that I got to do what I really wanted to do.
Oh, that's amazing. And Catriona, what made you interested in looking into vampires in pop fiction?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think it's just all the things that we've been talking about. I think it probably was the 1979 adaptation of Dracula with the extremely glamorous Frank Langella at an impressionable age.
Oh,
That probably did it for me. But I mean, I've always loved horror and science fiction and fantasy of all kinds. And then, of course, sort of in my kind of academic career, I've been looking at that from a more analytical point of view. But I don't think one of the things I like about looking at creative productions from a Jungian perspective is that I don't feel it doesn't kill the magic, if I can put it that way. It deepens your understanding of perhaps what's going on for people with it. And in writing the Cult TV Heroines book, I had such a good time. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that about academic writing, but I had such a good time sort of researching it and sort of trying to figure out what it was about these heroines and that people were drawn to and excited about, and as I was as well, by the most part, even the ones where I thought I would struggle at first, which I did, particularly with Samantha out of Bewitched, because she's just so nice all the time. But then the more that I watched it, the more I thought, she's not nice. She lies to her husband all the time about what she's doing, and she's really quite naughty. So I kind of found sort of ways to appreciate a lot of the female characters over time. So I think what has happened over the period since I did my PhD, and it's been interesting sort of thinking about vampires again, for today is that I probably have shifted my own perspective a little bit from the glamorous male vampire to thinking about the women in the figures in the films much more closely, and kind of thinking about what's going on for them. So yeah.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. You know how Stephen King says, when he speaks about horror and when he speaks about why people are drawn to horror movies, in his essay, Why We Crave Horror Movies, he begins it by saying, basically, it's because we are all insane. Do you both agree with that? Is there any insanity involved
I don't
in the
agree.
horror of vampires?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say it's because we like our thrills secondhand. I cannot comprehend why anybody would want to ride a roller coaster, for example, because that's clearly terrifying. And to me, real life is quite terrifying without adding to it by riding a roller coaster or going to horror movies. So I just think a lot of people need to get that thrill at a safe distance, or what they perceive as a safe distance.
I don't think I agree with Stephen King either. I think, if anything, that kind of storytelling is a kind of way of exploring aspects of ourselves in a safer kind of scenario of a narrative that is going to have a resolution at the end of it. And I think, you know, it kind of, yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about sort of the hooks that sometimes catch us unawares, but I think Jung definitely thought that the human psyche was capable of balancing itself, and that if we just give it a little bit of attention, we give the unconscious a little bit of attention and try and understand the images and the feelings and the senses that are being brought to our attention, that we'll always find a better balance for ourselves at the end of it. So it would, yeah, to be honest, I did go through an intense period, particularly during my PhD. PhDs are not therapy, but in the course of doing it, you do often have to encounter a lot of things that are coming up for you. But you know, I did get to the end of my PhD and kind of think, no, I'm done with vampires now. You know, I love the story. I still really enjoy the stories, but I'm not quite as intense about it as I probably was at the time. I see my old supervisor, John Isons here, has bravely come to hear me talk about vampires again. But yeah, so there did come a point for me where I thought, no, that I understand that now, and I don't feel it as intensely as I did in the past. So, you know, to me, that would be a sign that whatever the vampire was about for me had to some extent been brought to consciousness and resolved, insofar as such things are. So I did a kind of, came to the end of that. Maybe in the way that Charlaine comes to the end of a story. You know, you've got to the end of what that story was about, and therefore it's time to move on to something else.
Unless possibly Stephen King meant that people are insane to want danger and life-threatening experiences. That is pretty insane when you think about it.
Yeah, when he actually explains it, he moves on to say that we all have an inner lyncher inside of us. We all feel like killing someone from time to time, but if we actually do it, it's not without consequences. So
True.
Watching horror movies offers us this this mythical state of mind where we know this is fantasy, where we're not really analyzing, we're just seeing things in black or white. And then finally we get to commit that, but without actually committing it. So he's like, you get those alligators fed, the inner alligators are fed all the time, but without actually, you know, killing someone. Grace Topping mentioned before that, she wanted to kill people, but she did it in her stories. Something like that, right, Grace?
Yeah. A friend of mine's killed her ex-boyfriend 3 times.
Oh, yeah. So maybe there's this element in the reason why we write or why we even read specific genres. So Catriona said she's not done with vampires, but it's not with the same intensity as before. Charlaine, in the Gunnie Rose series, there are no vampires yet. Are you done with vampires, or could there still be a possibility?
Half of me hopes I am, because obviously the end of the Sookie books was a really tough time for me, because the ending of the book got leaked, and a lot of people were just, well, it was awful. It was just awful. It shows the power of the anonymous nature of the internet to be destructive and vindictive. And I don't want to repeat that. On the other hand, if I need a vampire to be in a book for some reason, I'm not afraid to do it. It just hasn't happened yet. There aren't any werewolves in Gunnie Rose, the Gunnie Rose books either, but there is a lot of magic, and magic can cause lots of different things. So I'm really enjoying exploring that and trying to imagine how magic is manifested. That's an interesting thought to me.
That's very exciting. We're all greatly looking forward to the 4th Gunnie Rose book.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Charlaine. Thank you so much, Catriona. My questions are over now, but I'm going to move to the questions of the audience, the very excited audience, as I can see so many questions and comments here. Okay, so I'm going to start with the ones that came in first. So we have, okay, most of them are links. Yeah. Oh, Glenda. Glenda says it was Lady Catherine Lamb, a lover of Lord Byron, who coined the phrase to describe him: mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Also fits vampires. And then Glenda says surveys show at least 5,000 people in the US who identify as real vampires.
Kind of depends on what you think of as real vampires. I
Yeah.
mean, do they mean classic vampires, or do they mean that would need a little more definition?
Sorry, I just wanted to say that figure is from a survey by the Atlanta Vampire Alliance. I suspect it includes anybody who drinks blood, even if they drink like a teaspoon a week or something of human blood. I don't know.
Okay. No, that's rational. I'm sorry I laughed for a minute. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
No, it was the Vampire Alliance that got me. It's hard to think of vampires as being that organized.
Yeah, you would know. I mean, you wrote all about them.
Yeah, I would just add about Byron. You know, Lord Byron, he was like this kind of rock star in the early part of the 19th century, and all these myths that used to swirl around about him, and drinking out of the skull of his enemy and all this sort of thing, most of which was almost certainly not true. But he did have this aura about him, and he did have fanatics who would follow him about Europe and sort of try and mob him and things like that. But but so in a lot of ways, I think the influence of Byron on the figure of the vampire, you know, particularly from the 19th century onwards, although, you know, Bram Stoker doesn't reference that directly. And we know some of the things that Bram Stoker did look at for his novel, because they found his working notes recently. But oh, thank you, Maria. It's awfully kind of you. I understand there is a paperback price coming out soon, so it will be cheaper. So yeah, so I think in a lot of ways the influence of Byron on the figure of the vampire has been somewhat underestimated over the years, partly because, you know, Dracula has been adapted so many times, but people at the time thought that Byron had written the vampire and not John Polidori, because it went out anonymously to start with, and they thought, oh no, it must be Byron who's written his autobiography. Anyway, that's enough about Byron. But
well, thank you, Catriona, Charlene, and thank you, Glenda, for the comment. What I'm sharing here is a few images of Charlene's books, and this here is the image of Catriona's book.
I love the cover.
I was so thrilled to get Diana Rigg on the cover, because she was Chancellor of the University of Stirling when I received my PhD. So I actually was doffed on the head to receive my PhD from Diana Rigg herself.
Oh, cool. That is cool.
So she had to be on the cover, really.
Wow. Okay, so we are going to go back to the chat box. Oh, Luke, yes, Luke shared the link, the one for Catriona's book. And we have a question from Kinda. How do you emotionally detach yourself from characters post-reading? I think the question is for Charlene, maybe?
Whoa. A really good book can carry me away just like any other reader. Though I have changed, being a writer changes the way you read. I mean, you're always aware there's somebody behind the characters. Whereas I think if you're not so focused on the writing of it, it's easier to get carried away. And sometimes to me, the mark of a really good book is if I think about the characters once I close the book. Many characters are easily forgettable, but the ones that you think about and wonder, you think, oh, well, what's going to happen when the book ends? You know, will they stay married? Aren't they going to get divorced? I really think so. If you think about the characters after it's over, I think it's a successful book. But I have gotten pretty good at detaching and going on with my real life because I have plenty of it. So it's easier for me than it used to be.
Okay. We have a comment from Jessica. Jessica Steele. As a Jungian writer who uses vampires, I can concur with Catriona. It's definitely about the transcendent function and active imagination. The heroine-villain dynamic in the stories uses alchemy to become a literal transcendent function. For me, I wanted to play with how to mesh the dark and light aspects of humanity and divinity. Thank you, Jess. Glenda, another comment. In 1872, Sheridan Le Fanu created the first female vampire in his story, Carmilla. Debbie Downer, SNL, brings every situation down. Then question. Would you view the world primarily as a magical, synchronicitous place? Glenda, is this question for either of Catriona, Charlene, or both?
I was thinking of it for Charlene, but I'd be happy to hear if they have a comment on it.
I don't know what synchronicitous means. I I do view the world as a magical place, not in the bibbity bobbity boo sense of magic, but in the sense that people can create a better world by their actions and their choices. Of course, they can create a worse world too, but I'm trying to concentrate on the good part. I have a very strong belief system, and that makes the world not magical, but maybe mystical or full of faith in a lot of ways. Yeah, I do, I guess. I do. Catriona?
I would agree with that. Certainly always leave the door open for the mystical and the unexpected blessings of life. I would certainly
Yeah.
say that. Yeah.
I think it
Okay.
was, can I say something quickly? I think it was Jung who coined the term synchronicity to represent things that happen together that aren't logically causal. Like you're traveling abroad and you meet your next door neighbor in a foreign country neither of you've ever planned to go to, that sort of thing. But sometimes they're magical, sometimes they're not.
Yeah, sometimes you meet the right person at the right time and it changes everything.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Luke says, I wonder if as readers and viewers, we are engaged in a vampire-like activity as we feed on the metaphorical life, sustaining blood of words and images.
Well, in my case, you're paying for it. So that's all right with me.
And Catriona?
I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay, Grace, yeah, I think we answered that question before. What is something you wished you had written? Yeah, Charlene answered that one. Glenda, Charlene, what made you become a writer? Was it since you were a child?
Yes. Ever since I could read, I wanted nothing more than to become a writer. And let me just give a shout out to my late great parents here because they read in front of me. There's no better example you can give a child than not only to read to them, but to show them you value reading too. We had books in every room of the house. My father had a separate book for every room. It just depended where he sat down, what he read. They took me to the library all the time. They actually bought me books, which was not easy for them when I was growing up. And there was nothing more I ever wanted to be than a writer. Once I understood there was a person behind every book I read, I thought, oh, if I could only be that person. For many years, I thought to be a writer, you had to drink a lot and live in New York, neither of which really appealed to me. But I gradually came to understand that you could be a regular, what I think of as a regular person, and be a writer. And it's just been so great. You know, the biggest thrill about being a writer is meeting other writers. You know, I love it. I just love meeting writers that I'm such a fan of. I just get real excited. It's hard to be calm and cool when I do that.
Well, oh, speaking of meeting other writers, Justina Robson. Hi, Justina. Very happy to see you here. Justina Robson, who is a wonderful sci-fi novelist, as many of you know. Justina says, I wish I'd written Jurassic Park too.
That would have been so cool. I love the movies. I love everything about it.
And Carly Brown, poet Carly Brown says, I'm curious about how and why we kill vampires in books. I recently read Dracula and was surprised by how much of the book was about them trying to hunt down / kill him. What do you think the significance of this idea of kill the vampire is in fiction? Thank you for the question, Carly. Very happy to see you here with us tonight.
Thank you.
Vampires are all mass murderers. I don't think it's any big mystery as to why we should kill them. I mean, if you kill one vampire, you're saving, like 300 lives a year, theoretically. So I think that's a perfectly valid point of view.
Maybe there's a more safe way to do it. Maybe we could just, you know how you milk the teeth or something from snakes? Maybe we could do that with vampire fangs, or I don't know, unvampire them.
If you go first, you go first on that. I'm not going to try it.
I think, to sort of look at it from a Jungian point of view, it certainly in the novel Dracula and a lot of the vampire stories, the vampires are associated with the shadow archetype, and Jung described the shadow as the thing a person has no wish to be. And so they're kind of like the worst parts of ourselves in many ways. And so, of course, we have to get rid of that, though of course we can't, which is why it comes back all the time, why vampires come back all the time. One thing I have noticed that sort of looking at vampire stories over the years is that female vampires do tend to be killed much more quickly and decisively than the male vampires.
What a stunner.
They get their heads cut off a lot of the time. So
of course they do.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of sort of misogyny in there as well, but it's interesting that female vampires get very short shrift, just too terrible to even contemplate sort of playing with the idea, so we'll get rid of them quickly.
Wow, that's an important thing here, even in the vampire world. Right, Kendra Stray. Charlaine, when you get ideas for a new series or standalone book, which idea usually comes to you first, the lead character or the general plot? That's an interesting question.
The lead character, because there's something particular I want to say, and the character is constructed to give me the opportunity to say that. I start with a little bitty kernel of an idea, and then the world that has to exist to support that idea, to carry it out, gradually begins growing around it. Like the pearl in an oyster.
Wow. I like that, like the pearl in an oyster. Yeah.
I just thought of that.
Oh.
I'll have to remember it.
We have a question by Alethea. As you mentioned before that the audience is attracted to vampire fiction because of the fantasies and minorities sublime involved, is it possible that people watch it to clear out conscience of ignoring those minorities and not doing more than what's asked for them? Like a way of redemption, psychologically.
Wow, that's an interesting point. And truthfully, I would have to think that through a little bit before I could give a good answer. That's very interesting.
I think that stories can work to give you empathy for characters in a way that relates to the real world, probably in ways that you're not expecting. So I think fantasy often historically is able to introduce ideas or like strong female characters at a time, when, sorry, I'm going back to my Cult TV Heroines again, but that before, if you like, that society more generally is prepared to accept it consciously. So I think it's fantasy can bring those images from the unconscious out for cultural consumption long before people are prepared to really accept that. I think we've seen that as well with the gay communities. in science fiction and fantasy long before we had equal marriage or any of these other kinds of ideas. So I would say from that point of view, I don't think people do it. Audiences are necessarily aware of that. They're just thinking, oh, well, this is a great story about whatever, but then they're perhaps confronted with a situation in real life and they realize that they can understand the other point of view. Anyway.
Yeah, we can look at it that way, definitely. Yeah. Okay. Jessica Steele, how much is the redemption aspect a thing in the dynamic? I'm thinking of Buffy and other stories. Redeeming the dark. For me, what is interesting is not just the temptation of the dark, but the temptation of the light.
I think that that's an interesting one, in particularly with relation to the Buffy the Vampire series, because you can, yes, it is about Buffy and it's about her story, and it is about her in the end perhaps moving beyond both her vampire lovers to sort of go off into the sunset as the kind of successful hero. But I mean, Jessica brings up an interesting point there, that both Spike in particular and Angel are drawn towards the light against their vampire nature because of Buffy. So yeah, perhaps that's one of the reasons why, well, I think it's one of the more powerful stories, certainly one of the few where the heroine gets to succeed and go off to fight another day. Anyway, yeah.
You know, the two male vampires do have that chance, but Drusilla doesn't.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I loved Buffy so much, and I think she's a great role model. She makes bad choices and she pays for them, but she also has the strength and courage to keep on fighting and find her way again. But not poor Drusilla, not Drusilla. She didn't get a second chance. So that's something I just thought about.
Yeah.
Other than that, I think Buffy is just great.
Yeah. He sure is. Oh, yes. Sorry, this is Glenda again. Isn't it a form of catharsis, as in Greek plays, the relief/release from strong repressed emotions? Glenda, I think you were referring to the process of watching vampire movies or reading vampire books, right?
Yeah, I think that was when we were talking about the transcendent function.
Okay. Right.
I think it is. I think it is. I think the difference is that catharsis is something that's sort of over and done with, in a sense, at the end of the play. You know, I was talking with a filmmaker just a couple of days ago about this, and you know, Charlaine was saying as well about, you know, the great stories are the ones you're still thinking about later. Yeah. And we were discussing the question of endings, and if the ending is too neat, it's almost like it's kind of done and you don't need to sort of think it over further. And I think there's definitely, for me, there's something about catharsis. It's like, yes, you go through the process of watching the Greek play, for example, and then, you know, it's finished and it's Jacobean tragedies, you know, there's blood everywhere and everyone's dead. But I think from the point of view of a transcendent function, it would be more of an ongoing process over a longer period of time, rather than just the way that catharsis is usually spoken about in the dramatic sense is kind of just, yeah, it's kind of done. Whereas I think transcendent function would continue over a longer period of time, which for me explains why fans get so attached to a particular set of stories or a particular story world, or, you know, and they want to stay in it for longer. That would be my hunch anyway.
All right, we have an interesting question here too. Abdurrahman asks, as a writer, you have to actually face obstacles, but what was the most obstacle which made you think of maybe going out of being a writer? So I
Many
believe Abdurrahman is
obstacles.
asking about your challenge, the biggest challenge.
Yeah, there were lots of obstacles. Most of them not of my own devising, but of the ups and downs of the publishing world. I've been cut by my publisher several times. I've lost my editor. Sometimes they would rather go off and get married than continue to be my editor, believe it or not. And I've had low sales that led to a series of mine being terminated, which is of course distressing. But I have never considered not being a writer because maybe it's my ego. I don't know. I just have this conviction that that's what I'm meant to do and I have to do it.
All right. Justina. Justina's asking, is there a good vampire that you wouldn't kill? Huh.
No, they're all mass
No.
murderers.
I'm just thinking about Edward out of the Twilight series, but you know, for me, he's so nice. He's just really quite dull, so I might kill him. Boredom.
Well, he's
I'm sorry.
yeah, he's the vegan vampire anyway, in the sense that he doesn't take blood from humans. He just goes for deer or panthers or whatever, which is kind of awful, really. But he doesn't kill humans, so I think I'd have to give him a pass.
Sorry, Twilight fans.
And Jessica is asking, Charlene, I haven't read your books, but have of course heard of you. Thank you so much for this talk because I really enjoyed listening to you. And thank you for joining us, Jessica. She says, the dark side of the vampire is like a complex that drains the life from you. Interesting that vampires in different forms have existed for centuries beyond the European version. Huh.
Yeah.
Correct.
All cultures have a vampire image.
I seem to recall there are quite a few from Malaysia, for different ones from
Yeah,
Malaysia
there are.
in particular. But yes. I think the oldest one is supposed to be a Sumerian demoness called Ardat Lilitu, but who's in the Queen of the Night tablet in the British Museum. But I think there's a bit of question about that now. So yeah.
Well, here in the Middle East, there's the term, you know, the vampire term is also quite common. I don't know how it started, but I mean, I'm sure it had its roots in some local mythology here as well. And the phrase to suck the blood, I mean, that's used a lot. So I mean, the term, the emotional vampires, the manipulators, you know, so it's this whole association with sucking blood and taking advantage or feasting on or being some form of it, you know, human form parasite. It is a really common image. Justina says, do you think that the female vampires being killed so fast goes along with the idea of vampires as an extension of the patriarchy? Because they are often fascinating men, romancing women, draining the life out of them, and with whom safety is only guaranteed by desirability.
Well, I can't top that. That's really it in a nutshell. You go,
Uh-huh.
Justina.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the female vampires are they're succubi, really, aren't they? And there's plenty of people who have said that the most well written and exciting part of the novel Dracula, which is hugely dull in many places. There's all sorts of long sections about railway timetables and typewriters and things. The most exciting section is the bit where he writes about the brides of Dracula right at the beginning with Jonathan Harker, and that's by far the most kind of exciting bit, which it may have been based on a dream that Bram Stoker had. So yeah, definitely more from his inner psyche than some of the book.
I'm not touching that one.
No, quite right.
And another question for Charlaine by Hani. Hani asks, how do you see character when you write?
I see them in my mind's eye. The way they look gradually becomes clear to me. And so after that, it's kind of established, and it doesn't change no matter if there's another version of it on film. I still have my own people, and that's who they really are, at least to me.
Do you ever base that on real people in real life?
I beg your pardon?
Do you ever base your characters on real people in life?
Oh, no, I don't, because that would be legally actionable.
Yeah,
I was going to say, I think you have a great way of writing from the character's point of view, but I think that comes out in their I was just thinking about, I mean, with Sookie, we all enjoyed her outfits, because she cared about what she wore and how she looked and so on. Whereas I noticed with Gunnie Rose, not so much, as long as she's clean, then she
likes to be clean, but that's it. She doesn't care after that.
Yeah.
And finally, we have a comment from Glenda, a nice analogy, actually. Female mosquitoes are the vampires of the insect world. Yep. Hey, so this was really lots of fun. I mean, I've never discussed vampires for that long in my entire life, and it gave me a new perspective. Not just on vampires and what they could mean, but also, the coming of the making of a vampire and what it takes, and this whole delving into your inner world and seeing what's there, seeing the magic of life and the magic beyond. It's just amazing. So thank you so much, Charlaine, for this wonderful discussion, and for your novels, of course. And Catriona, thank you so much. It was a great honor having you with us tonight. And Catriona, thank you again very, very much so for your wonderful insight and for the thorough studies that you shared with us today. Thank you. It's also a wonderful honor having you with us tonight. So we should do this again. You know what? It's actually a full moon tonight. It's been like really perfect, a perfect setting for discussing this. So thank you. And I look forward to hosting both of you again in the future. And we're all looking forward to the new Gunnie Rose book coming up sometime soon in 2022, you said?
22, yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll be waiting.
Thank you.
And I also want to thank the audience for their wonderful engagement. And I'm sure everybody enjoyed this as much as I did. So have a wonderful day, Charlaine. Have a wonderful afternoon, Catriona. And everybody else who's on my side of the planet, have a wonderful evening.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.